Fantasy, in the wake of Lord of the Rings, has become a mainstay of the box office, situated up there between rom-coms and the next action flick. The genre has grown and matured since Lord of the Rings, and many films and television shows have looked at Peter Jackson's films for guidance. This reliance on Lord of the Rings reaches as far as Game of Thrones, and seems to be part of the reason for Sean Bean's casting. The Lord of the Rings alum helps to sell Game of Thrones' more baroque take on fantasy. If you were to graph the development of fantasy as a genre, however, you would find quite a few outliers. Outliers aren't uncommon. In fact, they should be expected. Not every film comes at the right time to be successful, but in this case it seems that fantasy has gobbled up another genre, that of Faerie. Faerie in literature originates in medieval romances, where the hero would cross to fairyland, a dominion ruled by the fairy queen and full of magic. This would later give rise to the fairy tale. In film, however, Faerie has been flying under the radar for many years, and only begins to come into its own with films like 2007's Stardust. Unlike other fantasy films, Stardust lacks the traditionally muted color palette, as well as some of the more classical fantasy elements, such as grandiose scale and monsters. The 2007 film feels like it has one foot in fantasy and one in something else entirely. One explanation for this might be the lightning pirates, who seem to give off a hint of science fiction, but sci-fi themes don't carry throughout the rest of the film. Another reason for this feeling could be Vaughn's directing style, in which Stardust situates itself quite nicely. It wasn't until reading Gaiman's book that Stardust's place became apparent. It's right there on the front cover, a romance from the realm of fairy, not fantasy. This prompted a quest for other films that had been miscategorized, and two stood out: The Princess Bride and Galavant. According to Cary Elwes in his book As You Wish, The Princess Bride wasn't able to find box office success. He writes, "The movie, believe it or not, opened to mostly positive, if occasionally befuddled, critical response. Even those who praised the movie weren't quite sure what to think. Was it a comedy? A romance, an adventure story, a fantasy? The fact is, it was all of those things and more. But Hollywood abhors that which is not easily categorized, and so the film didn't quite gain the traction it might have deserved, grossing a respectable, though hardly overwhelming, $30.8 million in its first run, $60 million when adjusted for inflation." If Elwes is to be believed, the film didn't find its footing because of mismarketing, which makes sense because if Stardust feels slightly off as fantasy, then The Princess Bride is really off base as a fantasy piece. That being said, the film doesn't quite fit with Faerie either, the telltale trope of which is the crossing from the natural world into the fairy world. The Princess Bride lacks this element. Its structure falls more in line with frame narrative, which is a story within another story. But by switching back and forth from the boy and his grandfather to Princess Buttercup and Wesley, the viewer is forced to cross the barrier between Faerie and the natural world themselves. This probably places The Princess Bride somewhere within the experimental phase of the filmic Faerie genre. Galavant, on the other hand, must lie somewhere near the Baroque phase. It too lacks the crossing to Faerie, but the stories seem to constantly take place in foreign lands. As such, it can be inferred that the entire story takes place post-crossing. On top of that, Galavant plays on tropes established in the animated fairy tale genre. The entire show is a musical. While Stardust, The Princess Bride, and Galavant feel out of place within the fantasy genre, there are countless other films that are hidden elsewhere, not only claimed by fantasy, but also by other genres. Thank you so much for watching. I just recently hit 100 views on the video concerning We Need to Talk About Kevin. If you've already watched it, thank you so much for watching it and getting it to that point. If you haven't checked it out, I'm going to put it at the subscribe page. Thanks again.